everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, Sipping from the Data Firehose with DevExtreme, presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknall and Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. They'll investigate how your DevExtreme web apps can get at that most important and vital resource, your data. Paul and Julian will take an existing web app that uses the new DataGrid widget and demonstrate the different DevExtreme data providers. They'll go from sourcing the data from client-side JavaScript arrays to setting up OData and publishing web services. Also, we will do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation, so just type your questions at any time in your GoToWebinar control panel throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Julian and Paul.
Today we want to look at one of the exciting new client-side controls, which is the DataGrid, and that forms part of our DevExtreme suite. Now, we're going to build a website from scratch today using nothing more than a text editor. We're going to check out the bindings and show off some of the really powerful functionality that's built into the client-side grid. We're then going to take another tool from the DevExtreme suite, which is the OData service wizard, and we're going to show you how quickly you can build an OData service and deploy it. We'll then take a look at how to handle some large data sets, again at the client side. But first, let's take a look at the grid and some of the functionality and architecture. So the DataGrid itself is a lightweight client-side data grid with some pretty powerful features built in. You've got paging and scrolling, which means you can set up how it's going to interact with your end user. You can turn on virtual scrolling so that there's no pager control required. You've got inbuilt editing, and there's a suite of widgets behind there to provide things like calendar pop-ups and drop-down combos. You've got grouping, which can be applied at either client-side or interacting back with your data source. And as you can see from the list, there's a number of other key elements that allow us to provide a rich interface that is that lightweight client-side control. So what actually happens behind the scenes? Well, we can see from the diagram that you've got the list component and then you've got the editing component. One of the ideas that we wanted to do, or one of the concepts, was to be able to bind the grid very quickly. And to do that, we can work with the data source because it simplifies working with that data object. Now, it is a stateful object and gives you some interaction via events to be able to handle any changes to the data. If you want a much more granular control, you can move directly to the store itself. Now, the store is stateless and implements a universal interface for reading and working with any of that data that's being passed back and forth. Now, when we talk about it being universal, it allows us to work with a myriad of different stores. So you can see from this diagram here, we've got the array store, we've got the local storage, we've got the OData store, and then you can implement your own custom stores. And part of the package we provide, we've done that with Breeze and JData to give you some examples on how to implement that. Now, being a client-side control, all the data operations are asynchronous, and they actually return the jQuery deferred promise, which means that if you want to interact with that, you need to use callbacks such as done and fail. And I think Julian has a couple of things to add at this point.
I'd just like to point out that this is, we're following along with the latest in JavaScript here with using promises instead of just the basic jQuery Ajax type call. So with asynchronous processes, obviously you have to wait in some sense for the data to arrive, but just waiting for the data is bad news. So we've implemented this with the DataGrid where we use promises, and you basically specify functions for done and fail and various others. Done will get called once the data has arrived, and it's called a callback, and you can do anything you like in that particular case. You know you have the data at that particular point in time. Fail is a similar one where something went wrong with the call or the return, and you're given an opportunity at this point to say, okay, the data is not going to be coming back, but I have to somehow recover. Maybe the recovery would be to alert the user that something's wrong, or maybe try again, or something else like that. So we're using promises now within DevExtreme, and I would say you should learn how promises work and how to use them.
Excellent. Now, data can be passed in a number of ways to the data grid. You can have it from a straight array, and we'll take a look at this. You can pass it in from a URL, and it will work with straight out JSON data. Or it can be passed in from a store. And those stores, as we said before, were things like the array, the local store, the OData store, and then any custom stores you want. I think that's enough as far as slides go, Julian. I think it's time to write some code. So what I'm going to do is switch over to
Absolutely.
Sublime Text, and we're going to start with a couple of almost empty documents. Now this first one is just a boilerplate HTML document. At the moment, the only thing of relevance is it's pointing to or implementing some jQuery and the globalized library. If we take a look at the grid file that's also up there, it's completely blank. So we're going to start out with pretty much nothing. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is actually add in the web app library and a couple of style sheets to allow us to get access to the DevExpress controls. And make sure that's like that. And so what we've got here is a source pointing to one of our content delivery systems and referencing the web app.js file. And then the next two files are some style sheets, one being our common and the other being the light theme that we're going to be working with. And then the final line that we've just added in is a reference to the grid.js file that we've got in the background there. As far as HTML goes, I'm going to come into the body section and I'm going to create a new div tag. I'm going to give it an ID now of grid container. And we're going to set a couple of minor style properties up here. In one of our run-throughs, I actually tried to revert or move to HTML 5.1 according to Mr. Bucknall with my typing mistakes.
Yes,
so we'll set the height property to make sure I don't go off track, isn't that right?
Exactly, yes. We have to keep you on the straight and narrow.
Okay, so all we're doing is implementing the ID called grid container, setting the height to 420 for now, a max width, and a margin. And as far as working now with the grid control, that's all I should need to do in HTML. So next we're going to come over to the actual JS side of things, and the first part of this is going to be to instantiate the grid itself. Now, as I start typing this, Julian will give you a bit of a blow-by-blow on the JavaScript. For a man who's been studying it for many years, he's a resident. So what exactly we've done so far is basically just define a div within the HTML, which is where the grid is going to reside. The HTML doesn't say anything about whether there's going to be a grid there or not. So what we have to do now is instantiate a grid object using the DevExtreme library, and then we're going to configure that grid object to first of all be placed inside that grid container div. So what Paul has just typed in is basically standard jQuery, find the grid container div with the ID grid container, and then instantiate a DataGrid on top of that. And we have a configuration object passed into the constructor here, and the configuration object has one property so far, which is the data source, and it's referencing something called books, which we don't have yet. So I think the very next thing we have to do is define a books object,
In this case, it's going to be a books array, but yes, it's
absolutely.
an array. Yeah.
So we're gonna start out by just having a look at what happens when we instantiate the grid with some really basic data. Now, I'm not going to sit here and type in lots and lots of data. I'm going to become my own author, and the title is going to be The Extremist.
The Extremist. Ooh. Okay.
Now, so now, if I was to run that, Julian.
Yep. Let's see what happens.
We're going to see the CDN get hit, and the grid's been created and rendered with the elements from that array. Now you'll notice that I didn't have to set any properties up on the columns. It's automatically said we've got 2 columns and here's some data. So that's a good start. Let's see what happens when we add a little bit of data that's got some sustenance to it. So let's replace that one with some books that I added earlier. We can see now we've got things such as the author, the title, the year, the genre, the price, language, length, and format. All I'm going to do is refresh that page, and we're going to see the grid again automatically is drawn with that data. Now, there's no paging. I've got a scroll happening there. I can scroll up and down. And before I set any other properties, I do have an inbuilt sort facility, so I can sort by author, or I can reset my sort.
And the other thing to notice is the grid has noticed that some of the data is numeric and has actually right-adjusted that particular column for that numeric data. So year and price and length, for example, are numeric data, and it's handier, shall we say, to read them right-adjusted than left-adjusted.
Now that's all well and good to have the data coming in, but I might want to actually specify something going on with the columns. So what I can do is start to break apart the properties that are available inside the DataGrid element. What we'll do is just come out and make this like so, and then I'm going to bring in some objects called columns. Now, what we can see here, I've got this property, columns, I've got these data fields that are being linked to the particular field inside my data set, so author. And here I've got some other elements I can set. So I'm setting width, I'm telling title that there's this thing called allow grouping is false. You can see I've got visible, false, and I've got something happening on price, which is turning it to currency, etc. I'm going to keep switching back and forth to the web browser and just pressing refresh so we can see what changes in between these. And you'll notice straight away that the title didn't have a width, so it's automatically taken up the space that was left inside my div tag. And we've also got some columns missing. I can quickly come back into my JavaScript and I can say that I want the column chooser, and that's going to have a couple of attributes there. I can say I want to enable that, so enabled, and that's going to be true. And at the same time, I'm going to say that I want to allow my column reordering, and that only has a property of true. So if I save that, jump back and refresh, visibly we're not going to see anything in the table change, but we will notice that we've now got this little button at the top right. And when the user clicks that, they can choose columns that they want to show on the grid. And you can see that I can now add the genre. I can pull columns off there if I don't want them. And I can even move columns around. So it becomes very, very powerful at the user end so that they can visualize the data that they want to see. Anything to add, Mr. Bucknall?
Yes, I'd just like to point out that all we're doing at the moment is changing that configuration object in the constructor. So the configuration object that you pass into the constructor has various predefined fields that it understands, And all we're doing at the moment is setting values to some of those predefined properties. So here's another one that Paul's going to add, is the group panel property. It's an object. It has a property. That object has a property of visible, and also what text you can put into an empty panel. We'll see what this looks like right now.
So what we've now allowed is the fact that, being a visualization tool, the user might want to look at all the different formats that are available, and instantly seeing the result of that. I drag format up there, and the books are now sorted into format. Of course, I've still got the ability to sort the data inside the elements, and if I wanted to, I can even sort the format backwards and forwards along here. So it becomes quite a powerful set of tools. One of the things, though, is I don't want to be scrolling, so I want to quickly implement some paging. Now, obviously, we're not working with a very large data set here, but back to how easy it is to add these functions into the constructor. I'm going to go visible is true on the pager, and I'm going to turn paging size to 7. Now, obviously, to get up to speed with where these items are or what you need to do, you can reference the documentation on the DevExtreme website, and it's got some fantastic examples and lots of easy-to-use elements to do that. Now, if I do a refresh, we're going to see that instead of being scrolling, we've got the nice pager control in the bottom right-hand corner, and I can just page through my data in that way. So that's all nice and straightforward. How to quickly bind a data grid to an array, how to manipulate the data columns, whether it be sizing, grouping. You'll notice back in the text editor here, we said allow grouping is false when it came to the data, to the title field. So now in the browser, I can sort by author, but I can't group by title. So there's a lot of really nice functionality. And for those astute ones out there that have got their hand up saying,
you got a spelling mistake there.
You beat me to it. It's not that I had a spelling mistake. There is a method to my madness which will become clear very soon, I'm sure. Okay. But yes, I'm sure that Mr. Salinger did not have a stutter when he was typing his title. What we wanted to focus on was how easy it is to expand this grid to start working with other data sets, in particular the OData. So what I'm going to do now, Julian, is I'm actually going to take that array of authors and delete it.
Okay.
And he says, panicking, what are we going to put in its place?
Oh, I don't panic. I know you have a plan.
Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to head over to Visual Studio. And here I'm going to show you the ability that's built into the DevExtreme toolkit to create that OData service wizard. So I'm going to do File, New Project. I've got DevExtreme selected, and inside the templates is the WCF OData service wizard. I'll call this one Library Test. And click OK. And what's going to happen is I get a small step through wizard. Now, the wizard itself is based on the entity framework, so we're going to step through each of these little dialogues. I don't have a connection string, so I need to create a new one, and I'll go SQL Express. We'll just use a local instance, and we're going to pick the My Library database, and hopefully that's showing on screen.
Hang on a minute.
Click
yes,
OK.
there it goes. Yep, you're good.
So we click OK to move along, and I've got the option of changing my entity name. I'm going to click Next. And here it's saying that it's going to be linked to Entity Framework 5. That's all this machine has on it. And then the next step in this process is to actually select what tables, views, and/or stored procedures I want to include in my output. Now we're keeping it simple, and I'm just going to choose books. But if you had multiple entities and you had relationships between them, you can select them at this point, and the wizard will create the service that honors that model. So I'm going to choose Finish, and my model now gets created in the background. I don't need to look at any of the code that's generated right now. I mean, yes, if I wanted to implement certain security aspects or elements, I can go in and start tweaking. But as a straightforward, quick up-and-running service, everything has been done for me. Now, when I run this for the first time, NuGet's going to jump in and say that it wants to do a few things, which is fine. But effectively, I'm going to end up with a new web page that gets opened. The error is not a concern because I needed to actually tell it that I want data service as a starting page. And we can see that here is a typical document showing that, yes, I've got access to a collection called books. So at that point, I'm quite happy. What I'm going to do now, Julian, is take the URL from the browser and I'm going to create a data context with it so that the system's got something to bind to. Now, it should be as simple as saying that I want a new context object that's based on the DevExpress data OData context. It's a lot to try and spell correctly the first time in, but we'll see how we go. The parameters that we need to work with, the first one's going to be URL. And so, of course, I'm just going to pass in that local URL right now. And then the next thing I need to do is actually tell it that I want to work with a set of entities. So for each table or entity that you're wanting to bring back from that service, you'd create an object here. Now, mine is actually called books, and I need to specify a couple of minor things. First of all is the key field, and for me that's going to be ID, and the type of that field, so key type, is going to be an int32. Now, effectively, other than a semicolon there, that should be it. The context has now been created, and I can pass that through to the DXGrid constructor. There's a small thing we need to change inside this constructor so that it will get consumed properly, and that is to remove the word books, and instead we're going to say we now need to work with a store, and the store is going to be context.books. Now, all things being equal, if I come back to here, remember that the sample, I had TT in front of the for capturing the rye. If I do a rebuild now, then we can see it's actually retrieving that from a different data set because it's spelled correctly. You excited yet, Mr. Bucknall?
Oh, yes. So let's just recap there. We've defined a context. The DevExpress.data.OData context constructor is part of the DevExtreme runtime. DevExpress is our global name, if you like. So using the data property out of that, we get a constructor for OData. We've defined a URL where to get the definition of that OData from, and also define the entities that we're going to take out of that OData data source. There's only one that's called books, and all we had to do then was change the configuration object for the constructor for the grid so that the data source actually comes from a data store, and it's going to be that context object we just created, and it will have a property called books.
That's correct. Now, obviously, in my case, the table that I was pointing to was a replication of my array data, so I didn't have to worry about changing any of the data fields.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, that's all well and good. But what about publishing the web service and then consuming that data via Azure?
Ooh, okay.
So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to stop debugging, And if I wanted to deploy this to any server, obviously I could come through and choose publish. Now, in my case here, I would want to publish off to an Azure website. I could simply import my publishing profile, which happens to be called DevExtreme, and I could step through and it would go through and deploy the whole thing for me. But of course, as you would imagine, I did one earlier. So instead what we're going to do is we're actually going to change this address, and we're going to call it devextreme.azurewebsites.net, and just to make sure that everybody's happy, also me, I'm going to paste that in there. We can see that it's going out now looking for the service. Now this server is actually hosted in the West US, so it's got a little way to travel right now. You'll notice that there's two elements. We've got books, which is identical to what we were looking at. We've also got this one called customers, because I want to show you how to interact with a lot more data and then how the multiple elements works, or the multiple entities. So now the web service is being published, I want to jump back in here. We've got our original entity, which is books, and here I'm going to create one called customers. Again, passing in identical information because that's how the table was set up. We've got an ID and we've got a key type, and the key type is the int32. So that should take care of my context and my binding. It's going to be a little bit different down here. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of, I'm going to leave my pager in there, get rid of some other stuff for cleanliness. And of course here I want to point to my context of customers. I got rid of the columns obviously because the column names don't match my customers and it's just quicker. So I've saved that. Let's see what happens now when I run that. It's going off to Azure. You'll see that there's a nice loading panel gets displayed. So that's something that's again built into that control. If it detects that there's some waiting that's taking place, it's going to display a loading panel and tell the user what's going on. Currently I've only got 7 items on my page, and so I've got 1,400 pages because this record set has 10,000 records. And you can see I can move through the pages and it's going off and retrieving the records as I need it. Couple of things to look at here. Let's change the page size to say 20. I'm going to jump back in here and change the height of the div to 650 just to give us a bit more information on screen. And I'm going to implement another couple of those really cool features that we looked at before. To start with, I'm going to just bring in the filter row. And so filter row has a simple property of visible. And that's true. And then we're going to bring in the search panel. Now, the only real difference between the search panel and the filter row, the search panel is going to search any data whatsoever that's inside my my grid, whereas the filter row is going to allow me to apply a search style to the individual columns. So turn that on, refresh our grid. We should see the grid's now taking up more screen real estate, so I've only got 500 pages of data. We've got a search panel and we've got this beautiful filter row that's been added. So right now I can come along and I can say what I want to actually have my text interact with. So whether I want it to contain or not contain, or have it specific to say starts with or ends with. And of course I can reset that back to the default, which is contains. But let's see now, I'm going to type Pablo and straight away out of 10,000 rows that we've seen is coming from that Azure server, it's returning a result set. I can delete that and it's going to return back to the full 500 page. So as far as the smarts behind the grid and the caching and everything it's doing, it is blistering fast. We know that there's 10,000 elements. We can page through each of them. We'll see these pages coming in all the way up to 500. And you'll see the ID, if we go back to here, an ID of 10,000. So it's an amazing amount of data that's being pushed around and very, very fast. If I come up here and I say I want to search for Pablo, it's actually going to search any field and highlight that data in that field for me. So that's using the web service, from the OData web service, binding to large data sets. There's one other thing that I want to try and get in if we can, Julian, and that's the ability to edit the data. And in fact, I think I'm telling lies because there's two things I want to get in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to remove the pager.
Oh yes, we've got to do virtual scrolling as well.
Virtual scrolling.
Nice.
So a couple of things I'm bringing in. One is the editing mode, and the other is the scrolling. By implementing the editing property, I can tell it that I want to enable editing on my data set. I want my edit to be in row mode, and I also want the user to be able to insert and delete records. Now on top of that, I want to use something called virtual scrolling. The user doesn't need to start clicking through 500 pages, they just want to scroll down the list. And the other thing we're doing is telling it to hide that beautiful loading panel by default. So now if we come through and refresh that page, we're going to see the addition of the little plus button at the top here, which, as you can imagine, allows me to add a new record. Because of the way the OData service was created, all the plumbing has been taken care of, and I can start adding data straight into that database. For example, I'll come and say XYZ Julian and Bucknall. I'm then going to just go save. And if I use the search feature and just do XYZ, we can see that that record has been added successfully into the database. Now we'll notice that there's no page control at the bottom of my form. My form itself, my web page, isn't scrolling because I fixed the width, the height of the div at 650. But as I move my mouse over, we'll see the little scroll bar, and it widens as I put the mouse over it. But we can now see that that's scrolling. And as I bring my mouse down, you'll see that it's actually going to be prefetching data as it needs to give me an endless scroll. So I can start scrolling down and do everything that I want to do. So many, many ways of visualizing large amounts of data with the ability to do your grouping, to add, edit, delete records. I can jump in and edit. So this row here is going to be edited. Oops. We can see that it's got the beautiful widgets built in with calendars and other things that I might need to provide some nice user interface and feedback for the client.
Excellent.
Any questions, Julian?
Actually, I don't know. Let me have a quick look at the questions page here and see what we've got. All right. And we've been answering a few of them in the background. Some of the links point back to devexpress.com. Can you store on the local server? I think that's to do with the CDN at the beginning when we're talking
Absolutely.
About...
You can host those JS files on your own local servers, your web servers. There is no, you don't need to be pointing to our content delivery system.
Right. So that was Anthony. Another one from Anthony says, can you hide a column from the column chooser? So you were showing basically that columns were being hidden, and you could use the column chooser to add them to your grid or remove them from the grid. Can you just not show the columns at all?
That's a great question, Julian. What's your answer?
I'm trying to think of it, actually. I'm trying to remember how it all works in the background. And I'm going to have to pass on that for now. I'll have to find out and give the answer later.
My response would be, if it's not currently available, I think it's a damn good idea.
I mean, for example, on your OData service here, you have your data has, or your table has, a column of ID. I wonder if you can just hide that completely and utterly. There's no point in showing the end user what the ID of a particular record is ever.
Yeah, and you certainly would turn the editing feature off for that.
Yeah, yeah. So, great question, Anthony. I don't know the answer, but I think it should definitely be there. Might have to quickly look through the documentation on that one and ask the team. So we got Ben says, how big is the minified JavaScript file? So dx.webapp.js, how big is that? Actually, I could do that.
You can.
How big is it? How big is that file? So talk amongst yourself while I quickly have a look at. Have a look. Did I install it?
Well, while you're looking for that, Julian, I'm just going to bring up the js.devexpress.com site, which has some other really cool features of the grid that we just don't have time to start getting through today. And probably one of my favorite is the template feature. Now, obviously in our server-side controls or ASP.NET stuff, we've had templates for a long time. It's just as exciting that we can now build templates directly as a client-side grid. So you can see on this example, bringing in photos and doing other things. With any of the demos that are on this site, we provide full access to the code, the markup, any styles that have been used, as well as the data arrays and things that we might be working with. So it's certainly a great place to look through all the different functionality that is available. Just wondering if Julian found our answer.
Unfortunately, I don't have DevExtreme installed. I was messing around with it, as Paul will verify, yesterday and this morning, and it turns out I've uninstalled it and installed it again. So, can you have a quick look?
From memory, yeah, from memory, the actual web app one. Considering that it's not just the data grid that's included inside the controls. We actually have a suite of widgets all inside that library. We could throw a challenge out, Julian.
Okay, give me the CDN address, and I'll quickly look it up. It's cdn3.devexpress.com
/jslib /14.1.4 /js /dx.webappjs.js.
JS. Make sure I've typed that correctly, which I haven't. Boom. Okay, fantastic. Save as. The things we do for our listeners.
I think it's a great question. I know that certainly depending on the type of the type of application you're building, wanting to squeeze every little bit of space.
I would just like to butt in here for a moment.
Okay.
Mehul is telling me that it's 674 kilobytes.
And I've just saved it, and it's 674 kilobytes.
Thank you,
everybody.
My God. Thank you, everyone, for your assistance.
I wanted to make it a challenge for the listeners.
Oh. Yes, 674K. So 2/3 of a meg.
2/3 of a meg.
And then Ben is asking, is that minified or the full debug size?
That's the minified version. It's got everything in it. So there's, there's a color table in here. There is, the whole, thing for the grid. It's the maps are in here as well, and so on and so forth. It's everything that we do for the web. I think it's also got the charts in here as well. But let's find out. Yeah, it's got the charts in as well. So it's yes, it's big, even minified, but it does have everything in it. It's not like we're splitting out each individual control separately.
Any other questions, Amanda?
Yeah, let me kill that and then I can have a quick look. Share says, is search for the viewable records or against all pages? And the answer to that is all pages, the entire data set. Anthony asked, does the grid have form-based edit rather than row-based editing? And the answer to that is it has form-based editing as well. Ben says, how well does it play with knockout observables? Very well. It's all built on knockout. No, it's not. No, tell a lie. We do have a knockout binding for the grid. So once you implement the knockout binding, then, golly, your local array would be okay. Your OData doesn't make sense. And that's it. We have no other questions. Over to you, Amanda.
Great. Thank you, Paul and Julian. All right, everybody. We don't have any current webinars that are currently scheduled, but keep an eye out at devexpress.com/webinars for upcoming content. I'm sure we'll get some stuff up there very soon. And that is it for this one. Again, thanks to Julian and to Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And, of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.